Welcome to the new world, Creative Commons. Song, picture, video and so on. Share, remix, reuse. It's a new world of Creative Commons. Welcome to the new world, Creative Commons.
Oh, pato, the duck was dancing by the water. Quack, quack, quack. The real the man thinking how to quack, quack, quack. He was dancing to the samba, the samba, the samba. Oh, goose. The goose was getting swimming by home, home, home. He thought to give a dance a try. Home, home, home. He was dancing to the samba, the new thing, the new thing.
アメリカ、日本の事例ではないんですが、ヨーロッパ議会で昨年著作権を、上程されたという、事例がありまして、その時にはイギリスの議員のロビー活動が、すごく過激なロビー活動をなさったという、事例を聞いておりますが、ヨーロッパの場合は、議会とそれぞれの国における文化の土壌がそれぞれの国によって全然違うと思うんですが、ヨーロッパにおいて今後の著作権の、位置づけというのは、先生のお考えはどう変化するとお思いでしょうか。そのお考えを聞かせてください。
Well, unfortunately, I think that we're seeing in Europe strong evidence of a democracy gap between the European Parliament and what many people inside the European states actually want. And this is actually much closer related to the work that I'm pursuing right now about the way in which influence corrupts institutions of government. The most recent example of that was the decision to extend the term of copyrights for recordings. So the term of copyright for recordings in Europe was 50 years. And a bunch of recording companies and very successful artists started lobbying about 5 years ago to extend that term from 50 years to 95 years. Now, a point that I obviously made very strongly in the context of the challenge that we took to the Supreme Court for extending the term of copyrights was the one thing about copyrights that we all agree upon is that copyrights are intended to create incentives. And the one thing we know about incentives is that they are prospective, meaning you can only create incentives in the future. You can't create incentives in the past. Not even the United States Congress can create incentives yesterday. So when you extend the term of an existing copyright, you're not creating any new incentives. You're just transferring money from the public to this favored copyright holder. So it could make no sense for the purpose of copyright to extend the term of existing copyright. Now in Europe, there was much more aggressive consideration of these policy points by governments than in the United States. So in Britain, the Gowers Commission, headed by Richard Gowers, I believe, Jonathan Gowers, who was the former head of the editor-in-chief of the FT, did a massive study of IP and concluded that it could never make sense to extend the term of existing copyright. And similar studies had been done by universities throughout Europe. So all of these studies had come out to say that this could make no public policy sense at all. Immediately after the Gowers Commission report was published, there was an article there was an advertisement published in the FT, a list of some 1,200 different artists who had gotten together to demand that copyright terms for recordings be extended. Then it was discovered that a significant number of those artists were actually dead, leading me to wonder, maybe in fact you can create incentives going backwards, that in fact maybe that's what had happened. They'd risen from the dead to support the extending of this copyright. But more clearly what this was demonstration that it's just the record companies that were trying to extract more money in exchange for nothing to the public. So you had solid support in the public policy field to say that this extension made no sense. Yet just last week, the European Parliament extended the term of copyrights for recordings to 70 years, not 95 years. Now, the fact that they were so led to do that reflects the things that they're thinking about, which is not what makes good public policy sense, but what actually helps them in the narrow sense of the politics which they're concerned about. And that leads me to be very concerned that in Europe, where there isn't yet significant activism to resist this, we're going to see a lot of these changes happening. Just one more brief example of this. You might have heard there's a big fight in the United States about network neutrality, which are principles to make sure that the internet does not discriminate on the basis, owners of the network don't discriminate on the basis of content or ownership of the content or applications, to preserve the platform for innovation that the internet was. Barack Obama ran a campaign supporting network neutrality. The next head of the FCC supports network neutrality. Network neutrality, I'm sure, in the United States will be enacted into legislation in the next year. In Europe, there was an initial move to get network neutrality legislation passed. They had a draft bill supporting network neutrality. But over the last month, there's been a series of, quote, AT&T amendments. AT&T, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. AT&T amendments to this network neutrality bill that basically changed it from a network neutrality bill to a bill that explicitly allows networks to discriminate on the basis of content and applications. Now you might be puzzled why the American Telephone and Telegraph Company is in Europe lobbying on this bill, because it doesn't own any networks in Europe. And the reason is that they realize they can direct the European Parliament to adopt these bad policies, and then come back to the United States and say, well, in Europe they do it, so in the United States we have to do it as well. And I think we're going to see the same thing that we saw with term extension. They will adopt this change because there's very little political resistance that matters to the European Parliament, and the consequence will be bad policy that will haunt not just Europe, but the United States and maybe Asia as well.